August 1966. Past midnight at the corner of Turk and Taylor Streets in San Francisco's Tenderloin district. Inside Gene Compton's cafeteria at 101 Taylor Street. A 24-hour diner, 60-cent coffee, fluorescent lights that made the room look like daylight at 3 a.m. Transgender women and drag queens are eating, talking, checking that everyone made it through the night. An employee calls police claiming the customers are being rowdy. Officers arrive. Standard procedure. They've done this dozens of times. One of them reaches out to grab a trans woman for arrest. She throws a cup of hot coffee in his face. The cafeteria erupts. Sugar shakers crash through windows. Tables flip. Plates and silverware hurtle across the room. Women swing purses and high heels at officers retreating toward the door. Outside on Turk and Taylor, hundreds of people pour out of the surrounding hotels and bars. A police car is trashed. A newsstand burns to the ground. The next morning, when Compton's locks its doors to trans customers, a crowd returns and smashes the new plate glass windows all over again. 3 years before the Stonewall riots in New York City, transgender women and drag queens in San Francisco had just staged one of the first documented acts of collective militant queer resistance in American history. Not a single newspaper in San Francisco covered it. That absence, the silence around what happened that night, isn't incidental. It's instructive. San Francisco didn't just neglect this neighborhood. It contained it, concentrated its poorest and most despised residents inside 50 square blocks. And when those residents made history, looked away. The Tenderloin wasn't a failure of urban planning, it was a policy. And the people it was designed to disappear refused to be disappeared. A name reveals the whole arrangement. Tenderloin comes from New York City. In the 1870s, NYPD officers assigned to vice-heavy Manhattan precincts discovered that the bribes flowing from local restaurants and establishments were generous enough to afford them something better than what their salaries allowed. NYPD Captain Alexander Clubber Williams became associated with the arrangement, reportedly saying he'd been eating chuck all his career and had finally been assigned somewhere that paid for the premium cut, Tenderloin. The district where corruption was the real economy took the name. San Francisco borrowed both the name and the arrangement. By the 1890s, locals were calling the district south of Nob Hill and west of Union Square by the same term, though it didn't appear on official city maps until the 1930s. A 1937 federal investigation by Agent Edwin Atherton produced a scathing, unredacted report documenting police bribes specifically operating in the Tenderloin. Officers assigned there made money. Vice establishments paid to stay open. The system worked exactly as intended. Geographically, the neighborhood sat in a pocket the city's powerful residents could keep at arm's length. South of Nob Hill, west of the Union Square shopping district, east of the Civic Center. Madame Tessie Wall opened her first brothel on O'Farrell Street in 1898. Saloons and gambling houses filled the blocks around it. From its earliest documented history, the Tenderloin existed as a designated pressure valve, the place San Francisco sent the appetites it didn't want to name in polite company. The 1906 earthquake leveled almost everything. What replaced it shaped the Tenderloin's story for the next 100 years. New fire-resistant building codes enacted July 5, 1906, required brick or reinforced concrete exterior walls. Construction costs jumped overnight. To offset those costs, property owners rebuilt at greater scale than what had existed before, packing more tenants into every footprint to generate enough rent income. By 1907, 40 new Tenderloin buildings were already standing, most of them apartment buildings and single-room occupancy hotels. The Cadillac Hotel at Eddy and Leavenworth, opened in 1907, is still standing today. So are dozens of others, now cataloged in the Uptown Tenderloin Historic District on the National Register of Historic Places since 2008. An SRO is one room, usually a shared bathroom down the hall, no kitchen. Built for low-wage workers, clerks, secretaries, transient laborers, people who needed to be near downtown but couldn't afford to live there. After the quake, the Tenderloin became home to the nation's largest concentration of these hotels, and the density they created became the neighborhood's defining physical fact. SROs weren't built as a containment tool. They emerged from market economics. Expensive construction mandated by fire codes pushed higher density, and higher density filled those rooms with whoever could afford the cheapest units in a city with nowhere cheap to go. But the Red Light Abatement Act of 1917 took existing density and layered policy onto it. Prostitution and vice were officially pushed out of the Barbary Coast and directed into the more southern and less business-occupied Tenderloin. The neighborhood's density wasn't constructed as a cage. Once the city needed a cage, though, the infrastructure was already there. That sequence, economics first, policy second, matters. It shows how deliberately the Tenderloin's character was shaped over time. The earthquake cleared the land, the market rebuilt it dense. State law then used that density to concentrate everything respectable San Francisco wanted out of sight. By the 1920s, the Tenderloin was genuinely alive in the way neighborhoods thrive when they're too ignored to be respectable and too dense to be quiet. Dashiell Hammett lived at 891 Post Street, just inside the neighborhood's edge, and set his Sam Spade novels in its streets. In 1911, the Court Theater opened at 64 Ellis Street as one of the largest in the city. The San Francisco Symphony played its first concert there on December 8th of that year. Boxing gyms stacked above billiard halls, above speakeasies. A miniature golf course operated at 639 Geary as late as 1932. Its musical peak arrived in 1949 when the Black Hawk Jazz Club opened at the northeast corner of Turk and Hyde Streets. Over the next 14 years, Miles Davis, Thelonious Monk, Dave Brubeck, Ahmad Jamal, Mongo Santamaria, Jerry Mulligan, Cal Tjader, and Billie Holiday all performed there. Davis recorded his live album at the Black Hawk in 1961 for Columbia Records. Brubeck, Monk, Tjader, and Jamal all left recordings from the same stage, some of the finest live jazz documentation of that era. Fantasy Records, which released several of those albums, operated in the area. On any given night, the city's cultural establishment came to the Tenderloin for the music, then returned to their neighborhoods for the morning. After 14 years, the Black Hawk closed in 1963. What followed wasn't inevitable. It was the result of investment drying up, policing intensifying, and the city's long habit of treating the Tenderloin as a problem to contain rather than a community to support. Before the Castro existed as a gay neighborhood, before Harvey Milk, before the rainbow flags on 18th Street, there was the Tenderloin. San Francisco's Tenderloin has been a documented home for transgender residents since at least the 1920s. Gay bars were operating there as early as 1908, when a venue called The Dash ran with cross-dressing waiters until police shut it down. Female impersonator Ray Bourbon was arrested in 1933 while his show Boys Will Be Girls was broadcasting live on radio from Tate's Cafe at 44 Ellis Street. The queer history of the Tenderloin predates the Castros by decades. It's raw, less celebrated, and filed under a different narrative. Why gay people gathered here isn't mysterious. They didn't choose the Tenderloin out of affection. They were pushed there. In the early 1960s, Urban renewal campaigns cleared visibly queer working-class communities from North Beach and south of Market through targeted policing and redevelopment. Displaced residents landed in the Tenderloin, which sat adjacent and had one thing that mattered above everything else in that era: a bribery-based relationship between police and establishments that made enforcement transactional rather than ideological. A 1961 scandal known as Gayola confirmed what people in the neighborhood already knew. Police were systematically blackmailing gay bar owners across the city. The Taybush Inn raid on August 13, 1961, arrested 103 patrons in a single night, which prompted the formation of the Tavern Guild, described as the country's first gay business association. By 1964, Life magazine had declared San Francisco the gay capital of America. By 1965, the Society for Individual Rights had opened the country's first gay community center, and a group called Vanguard had formed in the Tenderloin, described by historians as the first LGBTQ+ organization that celebrated non-normative queer identities. With the Mattachine Society pursued legal recognition and respectability, Vanguard organized homeless queer youth, transgender, doing sex work to survive, ejected from families, excluded from most employment, largely unwelcome even in the emerging gay community that would eventually inherit the Castro. Vanguard's protest signs read, "All trash before the brooms," a direct counter to the police practice of sweeping the streets of queer people, and a deliberate claim that they weren't, in fact, trash. Vanguard's first president was Jean-Paul Marat. Its founding was partly under the sponsorship of a radical Methodist church 2 blocks from Compton's. Vanguard met at Gene Compton's cafeteria at Turk and Taylor. Open 24 hours. Cheap food. For trans women who couldn't rent apartments without being outed by their ID cards, who did sex work on these same streets because no legitimate employer would hire them, who could be arrested for having buttons on the wrong side of a blouse. Compton's was one of the only commercial spaces in the city that was reliably theirs. "Everybody that lived in the Tenderloin ate at Compton's," said Amanda St. James, a trans woman who managed a residential hotel nearby. Until, in the spring of 1966, it wasn't. Compton's night manager, the one who had tolerated the community, who let the regulars sit without harassment, died in spring 1966. New management installed security guards and began calling police routinely. Vanguard members were kicked out for loitering without buying anything and refused re-entry. Vanguard picketed Compton's on July 19, 1966. A local newspaper ran a piece headlined, "Young Homos Picket Compton's." Management didn't change its policy. August 1966. Hot weekend night. The exact date is permanently unknown. San Francisco's 1960s police records no longer exist, and there was no press coverage at all. An employee called police claiming transgender customers were being rowdy. Officers arrived. One of them grabbed a trans woman to arrest her on the standard charge of the era, female impersonation, which in San Francisco in 1966 meant a person could go to jail for wearing mascara, or for having hair too long, or for having buttons on the wrong side of their blouse. She threw hot coffee in his face. Sugar shakers smashed every window in the cafeteria. Plates flew. Tables went over. Women hit officers with purses and high heels as police retreated to the street, where hundreds of people from the surrounding SRO hotels and bars joined the fight. A police car was trashed. The newsstand at Taylor and Turk burned to the ground. When Compton's locked its doors to trans customers the following morning, a crowd returned and smashed the newly installed plate glass windows all over again. Historian Susan Stryker, who co-directed the 2005 Emmy-winning documentary Screaming Queens, The Riot at Compton's Cafeteria, with Victor Silverman, collected the eyewitness accounts that formed the core historical record. Stryker confirmed reliable estimates of several hundred people in the streets that night, with dozens and dozens of police cars responding, and disturbances continuing for several days. One officer who was on duty later acknowledged there had been unnecessary violence from the police. The women striker tracked down decades later Amanda St. James, Felicia Elizondo, Tamara Ching, described an eruption building since the day management changed. Not a spontaneous outburst, an accumulation of years of being grabbed, arrested, photographed, mocked, swept off the street like debris. "We just got tired of it," St. James told Stryker. "We got tired of being harassed. We got tired of being made to go into the men's room when we were dressed like women. We wanted our rights." Felicia Elizondo had put the daily arithmetic of Tenderloin life more starkly. "A lot of people thought we were sick, mental trash. Nobody cared whether we lived or died. Our own families abandoned us and we had nowhere to go." These weren't people without resources. They had built something in the rooms and streets of the Tenderloin, a community the city had never authorized and kept pretending didn't exist. On a hot August night, they defended it. 3 years later, a riot at the Stonewall Inn in New York City became the foundational myth of the American gay rights movement. Stonewall had pre-existing press infrastructure, a nationally organized movement, and circumstances that sustained a national narrative. Compton's had a complete media blackout. Not one major San Francisco newspaper mentioned the riot in 1966. The gay and lesbian press didn't either. Homophile organizations, invested in respectability politics, apparently had no interest in amplifying what happened at Turk and Taylor. Only one reference survived from the years immediately after. Stryker found it in 1995 while searching historical records. When she went looking for police records, the city archivist told her, in Stryker's account, that vast amounts of SFPD records from the 1960s had been disappeared. The archivist's word. Officers didn't want evidence of misconduct surviving into an era when San Francisco's politics had changed. By the time Screaming Queens screened in 2005, most people who had been in the cafeteria that night were dead. Tamara Ching had moved back to the Tenderloin in 1992. She told NPR in 2015, "We didn't think this was a big deal. It was a natural thing for people to do back then, to protest. Then, we didn't realize we'd made history." One immediate result of the riot was the 1966 establishment of the National Transsexual Counseling Unit, described by historians as the world's first transgender organization and the first peer-run counseling support resource in the world. In 1967, Conversion Our Goal, San Francisco's first transsexual support group, began operations. The Tenderloin, in the aftermath of a riot the city pretended hadn't occurred, became a national hub for transgender organizing. That organizing had an institutional anchor 2 blocks from Compton's. In 1964, a Methodist minister from San Angelo, West Texas, named Albert Cecil Williams, joined the leadership of Glide Memorial Church on Taylor Street. He chose the Tenderloin when he didn't have to. Williams helped create the Council on Religion and Homosexuality in 1964, described by historians as a pioneering organization in the LGBTQ movement in San Francisco. Glide became a coalition point for civil rights organizers, anti-poverty campaigners, LGBTQ youth outreach workers, and community groups that the city's mainstream institutions wouldn't touch. The Central City Anti-Poverty Program of 1965 to 1966, which secured the neighborhood's designation as an anti-poverty district partly through Vanguard's advocacy, ran through Glide's network. On January 1, 1965, police raided a Mardi Gras ball at California Hall on Polk Street, sponsored by the Council on Religion and Homosexuality, photographing 600 participants and arresting several prominent citizens. Glide was part of the organized response. Historian Susan Stryker described Glide Memorial Church as the midwife of the modern LGBTQ movement, not just in San Francisco, but nationally. Williams described himself in his 1980 autobiography as a Minister in Revolt, and Dangerous. He spent 60 years in the Tenderloin. He died on April 22, 2024. The National Park Service has designated Glide Memorial Church as historically significant for LGBTQ history. The neighborhood grew its own moral infrastructure not because the city provided one, but because someone with a minister's license decided this community was worth defending. In April 1975, Saigon fell. What came next changed who the Tenderloin was. Thousands of Vietnamese, Cambodian, and Laotian refugees began arriving in the United States, and a significant number ended up in the Tenderloin. The reason was direct. The neighborhood had the most vacant SRO units in downtown San Francisco. The mid-1970s had hollowed out the older, working-class white population, leaving hundreds of rooms empty. Resettlement agencies directed refugee families there because affordable, centrally located housing existed and nowhere else downtown could absorb the volume. Studio apartments designed for single adults became homes for families of 4 and 5 people. A local police officer at the time described them as vertical villages. By 1985, Vietnamese, Laotian, and Cambodian communities were fully established in the neighborhood. A Vietnamese-language newspaper, the Tenderloin Times, launched in 1985. A Laotian embroidery exhibition was documented in the Tenderloin as early as 1981, a Laotian cultural presence already formed enough to exhibit. Dozens of Vietnamese restaurants, banh mi shops, ethnic grocery stores, and cultural businesses opened along Larkin Street and surrounding blocks. In 2003, the city officially designated the 2-block corridor on Larkin Street between Eddy and O'Farrell Streets as Little Saigon, recognizing what had been there for 2 decades. Those businesses are still there. The families are still there, in the SRO rooms. One statistic reframes everything the cameras show. An estimated 3,000 to 4,000 residents under 18 years old live in the Tenderloin, the highest concentration of children in San Francisco. They are mostly from immigrant families, mostly living in SRO rooms. The same buildings constructed in 1907 for single workers, then filled by policy with everyone the city wanted out of sight, then claimed by refugees as the only refuge available. Those buildings now house children doing homework in rooms with no kitchen, with a shared bathroom down the hall. The drug market on Turk Street makes the news. This doesn't. What kept those rooms legally habitable, protected from conversion to condos or tech offices, was a legal campaign that started on February 1, 1980, in a 70-square-foot office at Glide Memorial Church. Randy Shaw co-founded the Tenderloin Housing Clinic that day while a student at UC Hastings College of the Law. Shaw became its first executive director in 1982. In 1988, he conducted the first comprehensive inventory of every residential hotel in San Francisco, the only complete survey that had ever been done, cataloging who lived there and under what conditions. San Francisco had enacted a hotel conversion ordinance in 1981 to prevent SROs from being converted or demolished. The Tenderloin Housing Clinic spent years fighting to strengthen it, succeeding in 1990,
then obtained injunctions against more than 25 separate ordinance violations. As strengthened, the ordinance gave any SRO resident legal standing to challenge conversion attempts. As a result, the Tenderloin now has a higher percentage of housing in nonprofit hands than any central city neighborhood in the country. As recently as 2025, proposed state legislation could have made SRO demolition easier. Housing advocates flagged the threat immediately. The fight hasn't ended. It's moved to Sacramento. None of that legal infrastructure came from City Hall generosity. It was built by law students working out of a room smaller than most SRO units, on behalf of tenants the city had spent decades treating as disposable. In 2017, the San Francisco Board of Supervisors passed an ordinance establishing the Compton's Transgender Cultural District in the Tenderloin, designated as the world's first transgender cultural district. Arya Saeed was among the founders who built the campaign for its recognition and became its first executive director. The ordinance covered the area around Turk and Taylor Streets, the corner where the cafeteria stood. Jean Compton's at 101 Taylor Street was placed on the National Register of Historic Places, the first such listing tied to the transgender civil rights movement. As of 2025, activists are still fighting to protect that building from redevelopment. Tamara Ching, who had spent nights at Compton's in the 1960s, who had spoken to Susan Stryker for Screaming Queens, who had moved back to the Tenderloin in 1992, lived to see the district established. That recognition is genuine. The lateness is also genuine. The city that created this district spent 50 years arresting, harassing, ignoring, and institutionally abandoning the community it was now recognizing. Police records from 1966 were destroyed. Newspapers looked away. Respectable gay organizations in 1966 didn't amplify what had happened at Turk and Taylor. No marker existed on that corner until Susan Stryker found a first brief reference in 1995 and spent a decade reconstructing the history from fragments. Whether the transgender cultural district is justice or the city co-opting a legacy it tried to bury is a question the community it commemorates has better standing to answer than the Board of Supervisors that created it. In January 2022, Mayor London Breed declared a Tenderloin emergency initiative, responding to the fentanyl crisis that had made the neighborhood's streets into something the cameras couldn't stop showing. A government-sanctioned overdose prevention site called the Tenderloin Center opened that year, operated for 46 weeks, and closed on December 4, 2022. San Francisco's total drug overdose deaths were 647 in 2022, rising to 806 in 2023. Those numbers are real. The tents are real. They are also the output of a specific history. A neighborhood designated as the city's containment zone for unwanted people, where police corruption was officially documented in 1937, where the police records from a historic riot were destroyed to conceal misconduct, that became the default destination for refugees because it was the only place in downtown San Francisco with enough cheap, vacant rooms. That neighborhood has been absorbing a public health crisis for over a century with the resources the city decided it deserved. Mayor Breed's emergency declaration acknowledged the crisis. It didn't acknowledge the 100 years of deliberate geographic concentration that accumulated into it. Cecil Williams spent 60 years at Glide defending the people in those rooms and on those streets. He died on April 22, 2024. He had described himself as dangerous, meaning someone who looks directly at what a city is doing and says it out loud. The Tenderloin has produced a lot of those people. It had to. San Francisco spent decades trying to make people forget this neighborhood existed. A name borrowed from a New York police corruption scheme was an admission, right in the label, of what the place was for. The earthquake cleared the land, the market rebuilt it dense. State law filled that density with everyone the city wanted out of sight. The Black Hawk gave the world Miles Davis live and closed when the investment dried up. Transgender women built community in all-night cafeterias because those were the only spaces available, made history in August 1966, and the city pretended it hadn't happened. Hiding ran both ways. San Francisco hid the Tenderloin from respectable society. In doing so, it hid its own accounting, that the neglect it imposed, the corruption it institutionalized, the communities it concentrated into 50 square blocks and then abandoned, had produced something no policy produces on purpose. A neighborhood that kept organizing, kept surviving, kept forcing recognition from a city that kept looking away. 59 years after that cup of coffee hit an officer's face at Turk and Taylor, there is a mural where the sign used to hang,
there is a cultural district. There are 3,000 children doing homework in rooms without kitchens. Randy Shaw's housing clinic is still fighting conversion attempts. Little Saigon is still open on Larkin Street. And the building at 101 Taylor Street, where one of the most consequential nights in American civil rights history occurred without a single newspaper noting it, is still being fought over. None of it was given. Every piece of it was built by people the city decided it could afford to discard. The question the Tenderloin now poses, with its cultural district and its overdose deaths, its immigrant families and its mural, its legal victories and its fentanyl crisis, is whether official recognition after 50 years of silence is justice, or a more refined way of claiming ownership over a history the city tried to erase. This neighborhood has outlasted every policy designed to disappear it.
Whether it outlasts recognition is a different test entirely, and the results aren't in. Subscribe for more stories like this.